Hello. The session today that I propose is about visible thinking routines as a formative tool. The intention is to find strategies for us to empower learners. And I just thought by using these visible thinking routines in terms of formative assessment can be one of the ways to empowering learners. So just so you know, there is an excellent resource and the link is just there. It comes from Project Zero from Harvard Graduate School of Education, which is led by several principal investigators. And then it gives us lots of ideas and strategies to be used in every subject in terms of precise visible thinking routines. So I really advise you to go and have a look on this website. So the first thing I would like to discuss is what do we mean by deep learning? So one of the intentions of this formative assessment task and these visible thinking routines is to make the learning deep and just to support the students in this process. So based on the Hewlett Foundation, this deep learning can be defined as an understanding of the core academic content, but coupled with the ability to think critically and solve problems with that content. So it's giving meaning to the learning and the ability to use the content that students learned, mix it with development of certain skills, in this case is critical thinking skills, in order to solve complex problems. Ideally, or theoretically, this leads us to potential interdisciplinary links, but mainly in the way to understand and give meaning to what students are learning in the classroom. So let's have a look and see, in order to reach that meaning that we're talking about, how can thinking routines be useful as a formative tool? The first thing I want to do is to clarify what do you understand by formative assessment. Yeah, so the formative assessment, based on Richer and Church, publication of visible thinking routines that was published, in 2020, they say that the formative assessment is the ongoing effort to understand students' learning. But I would like to also add the fact that this process is a two-way street process that involves students, but also involves teachers in a dialogue, in an interaction, in a discussion about learning. So it supports students to reflect on their own learning process, but it also supports teachers in the reflection on their own use of strategies and teaching development. So this formative tool is based on listening, observing, examining, analyzing, and reflecting on the process of learning. So basically, we can all find ways to listen, to observe, to examine, to analyze. The problem we have is to observe the reflection process. When the students reflect, it's almost impossible to observe and to witness that process. So the thinking routines can be used as a way to observe the reflection of the students, because reflection will take place out loud in a tangible way, and it will help us to inform our teaching and also inform the students' learning. This is when the formative assessment is meaningful. Okay, so probably we've all been in a situation when students ask, does this task count for something? And when we say, well, it's formative, so I'm not going to assess it, all of a sudden the students lose interest. So what about trying to make that reflection, that thinking process, something that we can see, we can measure? Okay. So let's first of all discuss when does the learning happen? What's the evidence that we have the learning is going on? So basically, following the same publication from Richer and Church in 2020, the learning happens when students engage with ideas, and then they ask questions about those ideas. They explore potential interpretations, views, and based on that, they will construct meaning. And we teachers become the guides, the facilitators of this process. So basically, in order to do that, we really need to understand what are our students thinking. That's very important. We need to understand, to see, so we can measure and we can use their thinking process in a tangible way and in a meaningful way. So what we do basically is, in terms of building the understanding, I would like to follow the steps which are proposed in this slide. And by using those steps, I'm going to be using this session as an evidence, as an example on how to construct visible thinking routines to build understanding. So first of all, we're going to observe and describe what is there. Then we will ask questions. Based on those questions, we will make connections. Those connections would allow us to consider viewpoints, interpret those viewpoints, and find evidence for both, which will allow us to uncover what we're learning, and then finally capturing the meaning in what we call the aha moment. This is the process of building understanding. How can we then use those visible thinking routines to build understanding? So let's start, and please don't forget this scaffold of ideas. The first thing is then we're going to see what is there. What have we said up to now about these visible thinking routines? And then we're going to use a routine that will allow us to ask questions and then make connections. So what we're actually doing is we're covering the first points of the previous slide. One activity that can be found on the website that I shared with you at the beginning is this one. What makes you say that? So what we do is by asking two simple questions. What is going on? What do you think? And what do you see that makes you say that? So I could be asking you, what's going on? What we've been talking up to now in terms of visible thinking routines? And what do you see? What is your opinion based on in terms of visible thinking routines up to now? This activity itself is a visible thinking routine because I'm asking you questions and you will reflect out loud, and your reflection process becomes evident to me. The next step then is going to be considering viewpoints about the different viewpoints that people might have about visible thinking routines. And these are activities that can be used. For example, we could then, if we had the chance to be face-to-face, or if you want to participate in the chat so we can have a back and forth conversation, we can brainstorm all the different perspectives that we all have about visible thinking routines. And then we could pick one of the perspectives, being ours, being someone else's, and using the following starters to discuss about these viewpoints. Yeah, I'm thinking of something in particular from the viewpoint of my friend, of myself. And a question that I have from this viewpoint is, so those are examples again of visible thinking routines that will allow us to share different perspectives and different viewpoints about one problem. And by getting the viewpoints from other people, we might change our mind, but we will definitely be able to have different perspectives that will help us to solve the problem. Now, let's move into the next step in terms of building knowledge, which is the interpreting. In order to interpret the information we have, I would like to use this other visible thinking routine strategy, which is called See, Think, Wonder. So see will be the description, but now we're going to focus on the interpretation, which is the thinking. So I can be asking you, what do you think? What makes you sure about your opinion about visible thinking routines? What evidence can you provide with in order to support your thinking about what visible thinking routines are? So by bringing up your evidence, by backing up what you think, you are interpreting then the problem and the situation. Okay? And then keep moving on into this building of knowledge. The next one is then, how can we get evidence? What kind of activities can we put in place for students to bring evidence to their thought? We can ask a simple question like, what evidence do you have to prove that? And then give them the opportunity to reflect and to share their evidence with us. But what you can also do is collect the evidence through a peer or a self-assessment. An activity to collect evidence through peer or self-assessment is what is called think, pair, share. This one, for example, yeah, the intention of this activity is to activate the reasoning and to have the students explaining why they think what they think. How can they use the evidence that they found in the previous step to justify their thinking process? This activity of think, pair, share involves posing questions to students, or they can pose questions to each other, asking them to take a few minutes of thinking time, and then turning to classmates to discuss, to share their thoughts. And by this sharing process, we as facilitators, we can walk around the classroom and listen to what is going on and to what those collaboration strategies are happening. And then we can guide some thoughts, some ideas. We can just let the conversation flow. We can take part of the conversation, pause it if needed, but making sure the students realize that this activity, this active thinking routine, makes them reasoning and explain a thought. Finally, and in theory, after putting in place all these routines one after the other, students will capture the meaning of the problem. They will have this aha moment. Hopefully it's a moment that you're having right now by saying, no, I can see now the practicality of putting in place visible thinking routines, because by answering questions, I have been able to think out loud, and then the teacher, the facilitator, has been able to formatively assess my thinking process because he witnessed it by me developing my reflection in a way which is active, which is meaningful and purposeful. So at the end of any activity that we can have in class, any unit, any proposal, reflection, it's important. Allowing students to reflect on what happened, reflect on what they've learned, reflect on what is still unclear, so we can then reflect on our own teaching strategies and see to what extent what we've put in place, what we've implemented, has been useful for the students. And I'm proposing you 2 visible thinking routines which are based or which support the reflection process. This is one, the compass point. So you can have a big compass point on the wall, and you can give stickers, little notes to your students, and tell each one of them, even as an exit ticket, for example, okay, can you please stick something in E when you're excited about something you've learned, W, the west, if you're worrisome about something, north, if you still need to know something more about a problem or a topic, and finally, in the south, a suggestion for moving forward. What is your suggestion in order to move forward to the solution of that given problem? So this is on the wall, and then you can then look at the reflection process based on what they've written in each one of these sticky notes. Not only that, it's not only for you, it's also for the students themselves to be aware and to witness the reflection of their colleagues, but by what they've written on the wall. And it helps you also to reoriented lesson next time. So what am I going to change? What am I going to do differently this time? Another reflection process is just ask them to fill in these 2 easy sentences. I used to think, now I think. So they will compare and even contrast what feelings did they have at the beginning of the unit, at the beginning of the session, and what do they think now? And I could easily be asking you this question to yourself. What did you used to think about visible thinking routines? What about now? After these 15 minutes, have you changed your mind in any way? Maybe you haven't, which would be hopefully good news. Or maybe you have, and then now your idea, your opinion on visible thinking routines is much more positive than it was 15 minutes ago. But by filling this in, this can be done in a written form, this can be done orally, You can even have the online students doing it. Now that we talk about the difficulties of teaching online, they could record themselves in Microsoft Teams, Zoom, and they can be answering to these. I used to think, now I think. Another visible thinking routine. I would like to finish this session by a very nice thinking routine that I saw in a conference a couple of, well, probably a year ago. So I hope that you found your piece of wood in this session. I hope that these 15 minutes gave you one little piece of wood that you found probably on the shore of the beach. Yeah, and then you picked that piece of wood, which can be an idea. Yeah, keeping the piece of wood as a metaphor of a new idea, a new thing. So now your role is going to be to adapt this piece of wood to your needs. So whatever you've learned, and hopefully you've learned something from this 15-minute session, maybe now you can take that, what you learned, go back to your classrooms and think about how can you carve that piece of wood, how can you use it in a way that gives meaning to you. And then if this is the case, it would be great if you could share in the chat of this session what was that piece of wood and how have you adapted it to your needs, and then probably even reflect on how useful was it. Okay, so I hope this session was useful, and please, if it was, share with your colleagues, share with your friends, with other teachers, and then please write in the chat any comment you might have, any discussion, any question. See if we can interact with each other and share best practices.